Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first webinar for the NASPA All Faculty webinars. This particular year, we are focusing on the civically engaged faculty. That was something that really stemmed from our faculty breakfast at NASPA last year, was that there's a real desire among the faculty to have deep conversations and meaningful conversations about what's going on in our society and in our world. And that starts with who we are as scholars and within our identities, and then stems beyond that into the work that we do. So we're really excited to kick off today with two wonderful scholars who they actually were very excited and on board. I think back in March or April of last year, we went ahead and got this scheduled because Claudia and I were talking, and we're like, yeah, this is going to just be such a dynamic and needed conversation for us to have as scholars in the field. So today, I would like to welcome Dr. Claudia Garcia-Lewis and Dr. Marie Nubia Feliciano, and I'm going to turn it over to them to hold our session, and I'm going to simply step back and be the host with the most and make the slides. But if anyone needs anything, please let me know. I will also be kind of managing if there are folks who need to be muted or unmuted. I will be facilitating that, okay? And then what we'll do is we'll allow them to present, and then we'll come back together at the end for Q&A and things of that nature. Sound like a plan? All right. Oh, and I'm Amy French. I'm a assistant professor at Indiana State, and I serve Region 4 East as the Faculty Council representative. So that's about me too. All right, here we go. All right, I'm turning it over to you all in just 1 second. Let me share my screen. All right, can you all see just fine?
Yes.
Perfect.
Do you want to take it away, Marie? Introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for being a part of this webinar. It's sort of a coming together of both my work in student affairs for about 12 to 15 years and my scholarship within my dissertation, working and seeing myself as an educator of students outside of the classroom before I was in the classroom. As a staff person, I saw that. So this particular session is important for me in that respect. And I've worked in student affairs primarily at UC Irvine here in Southern California, where I am at. And now my faculty work now primarily is at Chapman University.
Claudia Garcia-Lewis. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas in San Antonio. This is really a labor of love for both Marie and I. When we met, we were talking about the importance of acknowledging and recognizing Afro-Latinx individuals within the Latino community. And what we came to realize is that oftentimes conversations around Latinos, Latinx individuals as a whole tend to favor individuals who look like myself. So we thought it was definitely important for us to continue our scholarship. Both she and I have done research with Afro-Latino students and on their experiences in higher education. Now, we want to make sure that everyone knows that the study of Afro-Latinx individuals is not necessarily new. Sociology has done a great deal of work. Dr. Jimenez Roman has done tremendous work around this area in the field of sociology, psychology, anthropology, ethnic studies. They have gone in and disaggregated intragroup diversity within the Latino community, but higher education for some reason has been lagging. So we feel that it is both a professional and personal imperative that we begin to disaggregate numbers within the Latino community. As many of us know, Latino is an ethnic group and it's a socially constructed group, and so you have Hispanics within the United States and only within the US. Anything outside of the US, people don't understand what Hispanic is, and so all of that has informed what we are doing today. In addition to that, Marie mentioned that she has a number of years of experience in student affairs. Myself, I have 6 years of student affairs experience, so we wanted to make sure that we were able to both grasp the theoretical frameworks and understandings of minoritized students, students of color in education, Latino students, and then bring in our professional experiences of working in the field, and then bring it down to help us better understand how to serve our students, and not just serve our students, but be able to provide them with the opportunity and the support to provide recognition for them on our college campuses. So as you may see, Marie put together this beautiful PowerPoint, and you will see on the bottom right-hand corner that Afro-Latino identity isn't something new. It has been around for a very long time. You will see pictures of Latino American conquistadores and libertadores, Jose Marti and Celia Cruz, for example. These are people that span what we know now as the history of Latino America. So Afro-Latinos have been Afro-Latinos in Latin America for a very long time. This is nothing new. They are not, a new race or a new ethnic group, but I think it is fair to say that we are finally at the point where we are calling on each other to recognize the rightful place within the ethnic diversity or the ethnic group.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just a little picture of ourselves. Go ahead, Marie.
A little more of an explanation of what we do in our research background and those sorts of things. Then we can go into the next slide.
Okay.
Claudia, you want to?
It's one more.
Oh, sorry.
So before we got started, what we wanted to make sure that we began with was that we know that there's a lot of terminology out there. We know that there's Hispanic, there's Latino, there's Latinx. We know that there's a lot of terms Chicano, a lot of terms thrown around, Boricua. And so before we went ahead, we didn't want to define every single term, but we did know that for a lot of people, especially people working in student affairs who may not necessarily identify as Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, sometimes it's difficult to understand what each term means. And so we wanted to make sure that we started off with that and to recognize that it is complex. Identity is complex. When we look at Hispanic ethnicity, it is a social construction within the United States. It came out of the 1970 census in an effort to categorize and group together a group of individuals within an ethnic category, right? And so what that means is that individuals of various racial backgrounds were put into this group based upon the language that they spoke, which was Spanish. However, some people may categorize, for example, Brazilians within the Latino community or the Hispanic community, while other scholars may recognize, for example, Haitians within that community as well. So as you can see, the categorization is not perfect. It depends who you talk to and how they come about in understanding that identity. So Hispanic is a social construction by the government within the United States to categorize an ethnic group. Latino tends to be more of an effort within the Latino community or individuals that are from Spanish-speaking countries to say, well, we could, if we have to be put together, then we recognize Latino as an identity. And then you have terminologies or identities like Chicano, for example, that is more of a activist identity that has deep historical roots within California out of the 1960s and 70s social rights or civil rights movement, where they decided to self-identify. Sometimes people tend to categorize it more with Chicano or Chicano more with Mexican Americans, but that's not necessarily true. It's more of a social political identity. Then you have Boricuas, for example, in the East Coast, and so that has more deep roots within the island of Puerto Rico and in the indigenous peoples there. So as you can see, there's terms and terms and terms and terms, but the most acknowledged ones tend to be Hispanic and Latino. In this case, Marie put together the terminology that we will be utilizing today in this presentation. Marie. Yeah, do you want to go through it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we start off with the term Afro-Latino. It is something that refers to the Latino experience within the African diaspora. Or in other words, Africans that come up through the Latino cultural experience both in the Americas, including the United States, South America, and the Caribbean. And you'll see it written with an O or an @ or an X in different ways. And depending on your level of comfort with the terminology and the written form of the word, as long as you're able to then, knowing your audience and being able to use it so that you can engage, that's probably the best term to start a conversation with, however you want to write it. It isn't, am I using the wrong term? Am I using the right term? It's really just a term to start a conversation. And we don't want to, there's no policing of language for the most part. So you'll see it written in different ways. Afro-Latino. Looking at how people look and feel about the different attributes that make up who they are as a combination that make an same with mestizaje, or we're looking at someone indigenous and European, but that term is also changing over time, looking at now including the African, so that mestizo or mixed is not just traditionally being seen as indigenous or European, but also including the African contribution to that identity marker. Pan-ethnicity, grouping of various groups together based on their related cultural origins. So the term Boricua, for instance, includes people that were both born on the island and born in the diaspora. It's a term that we take on, because I'm from Puerto Rico, to take on as a moniker of identity. Boricua, so we're from the island of Puerto Rico, which is an indigenous term, Borinquen. So the term Boricua is a derivation of that term. And that's what pan-ethnicity really encompasses. That mindset of triple consciousness. We're perceiving ourselves in different ways, in different contexts, both our racial and our ethnic and our social. For instance, the racial matrix in Puerto Rico allows more for a national identity to be part of who we are. But when we come to the United States, a racial matrix, even within, especially within families, to separate. Difference is the norm on the island of Puerto Rico, sameness is the norm in the United States. And so it forces us to have not just a national conscious informed identity, but now something that includes a racial component, and then how others perceive us, the racial and the ethnic interplay, and how that interacts with the world. So you've got that triple consciousness, which is similar to Du Bois' double consciousness concept, just pushing that, expanding that to now encompass a different interpretation of a racial matrix as it applies to people of African descent in the Latino community. And then the issue of colorism, primarily based on skin tone, but other attributes that demarcate you away from what the expected norm is of being a Latino. Has these preconceived markers in the minds of people, an image in the minds of people, and then anything that deviates from that is something that is created, is made different. And colorism is one of the ways in which we differentiate people that deviate from what we consider a norm. And colorism is a prejudicial way of reducing people from the white is right all the way down to black is what's not desired. And colorism is used to push, to sort of divide people. It's like, okay, so you're a light-skinned Latino, so you've got a certain amount of cultural capital and privilege that someone who's a dark-skinned Latino doesn't. And so colorism is used in that sorting process.
Beautiful. And so we're going to stay here, Amy, real quick. We wanted to point attention to the right-hand side of your screen. As you will see, this is almost like a color coding system that was utilized by the Spaniards in Mexico. And the reason why this is particularly important is multiple things. When we think about Afro-Latinos and we think about their experiences, oftentimes we don't think about Mexico or Mexico having a deep historical Afro presencia or presence, and the reality is that it has been there forever. Well, since the invasion, or people call it the conquest. And so what the Spaniards did were that they were meticulous bookkeepers, and so there's pages and pages of classification, trying to figure out how to classify, but also keep their power within this structure, right? So then you come to a land and you invade it, and then you have to somehow keep the native people under control. So what they ended up doing was they developed this thing called a castas system, very similar to a caste system, a casta system. And so they identified three primary races. They identified the Europeans, the indigenous peoples, and negros or black individuals. And so based upon their combination, then you will see here that there are 16 official mixtures, and I put quotations on it because while there was 16 official mixtures, they identified that there were hundreds of combinations that could result in this, which results in why and manifests in current day Latinos. You will meet Latinos who are Latinx individuals who are blonde hair with green eyes and whose family is from Latin America, and their roots are there. And then in the same family, you will have individuals who are darker skinned. And so we tend to cover the whole hue and representation of skin tones because of this historical blending. What we also wanted to make sure that we touched on was that colorism really began during the colonial period. So how do you keep a people oppressed? How do you keep your rule over, there weren't that many Europeans, but there were a lot more indigenous peoples in the land. And so what they ended up doing is that you have to buy into the system of castas, right? And so you create this hierarchy where you create whites in one end, so that's where you want to be, and then the black or negros on the other end. And so what ended up happening was that people began to buy into it by saying, oh, well, I'm not as dark as they are, I'm getting closer to whiteness. So they began this colorism aspect as a way to say, well, I'm better than you, and I'm reaching whiteness as a way to try to better themselves. And so this now is the current manifestation of colorism. And in many ways, when we hear of intragroup discrimination, it's often, like Marie said, it's often based on individual on phenotype or on skin tone, I'm sorry, on hair texture or on facial features or on things like that. And so even within families, you will see that this often happens. We want to make sure that you know that this is not just within the Latinx community. This happens across the board in many groups and in families across the board. And so part of that is the legacy of colonization. And we wanted to acknowledge that continues to impact not only how we view ourselves, how we view our students, but then also how society continues to uphold the legacy of colonization in the way we categorize and see ourselves, and even in the social construction of race and ethnicity.
Right.
Next. Marie?
Yeah. Well, there's just some very brief facts and figures of the present of Afro-Latinos in the United States. We're going to be showing a little clip of what we talk about here with the presence of the African people in the Americas, of those that were brought over during the Triangle Trade, kidnapped and brought over. 5% of the enslaved Africans actually ended up in the United States until it was made illegal in 1820, or thereabouts. And then it was illegal to import between countries because other countries started to make that illegal. The United States decided, well, then fine, we'll make our own. And so it continued the process in the United States, but they were no longer importing. The rest of those individuals that were brought over were distributed from Mexico on south in the Caribbean, Central South America and Mexico. So there's a large presence of African people in the Americas, with the United States. And so they're in enclave, sort of in Costa Chica in Mexico, it's primarily, and then the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, closest to the Caribbean, of course. But then you see little enclaves in Panama and in Belize and in Nicaragua and in Brazil and all those other places. The African presence has been there for a very long time, since the 50s. So it is something that shouldn't surprise people when we sort of come to the surface and we find ourselves in spaces. But for some reason that we will go on into later, we don't make it as far as college, because when you map on skin color and race, you can map on economics, and you'll see that the lighter you are, the higher you are in the economic ladder, the darker you are, the lower you are in the economic ladder. And that is a presence you see throughout the Americas. So understanding that when you look at in Puerto Rico and you see that the governor now, he's a very, very European looking guy. And a lot of the people that you probably will see in San Juan are very light, but you just go a couple miles out of the city and that's where the rest of us live. 80 to 85% of the population of Puerto Rico looks just like me. Not like Ricky Martin or Jennifer Lopez, but that's what we see. And so understanding that that type of clustering happens throughout the Americas of Africa with regards to skin color and how people are spread locally. And then we're talking about then our presence on college campuses. 19% of Hispanics are classified as Hispanic enroll in college, and 99% or 9% actually graduate. So we have a pretty high retention dropout rate, but it is sort of on par with African Americans that enroll at about 14% throughout colleges in the United States and have about a 9% graduation rate on average. So that's another snapshot into the class system that encases the African American and Hispanic community. And we as Afro-Latinos sit in that space. So sometimes it's hard to find us because depending on where we fit or where we're allowed to fit, you will find us in the African American community, or you'll find us in the Hispanic or the Chicano Latino students population. In places, or we find ourselves in places that allow us to be there.
And so one thing that we have to keep in mind is that there is no census count of Afro-Latinos, right? There is no official count of understanding what the actual presence is of an Afro-Latinx individual. And part of it has to do with, number one, our government and how we collect data. So as mostly public institutions, what we do is we follow federal guidelines, census guidelines in collecting data. So if you check Hispanic, then you cannot check anything else. You cannot check Black Hispanic because they will not count the Black aspect. So we have to go in there and try to almost disaggregate data, but it's very difficult to do so because of not allowing for individuals to both identify as Black and Latino. So we have to make sure that we acknowledge that we don't know what the actual count is of Afro-Latinx individuals. In addition to that, when census data is released, the overwhelming majority of individuals who classify as other or self-identify as other tend to be Latinos. And the reason being is because we have a very different conceptual understanding of race and ethnicity. So despite generational, Latinos being in the United States for generations, 6, 7, 8 generations, or to have been members of this, living in this community before it was the U.S., their understanding is still not in alignment with the social construction of race and ethnicity, which means that they will self-identify mostly with the nation of origin of their family or their family's history. So that other aspect is also extremely important to acknowledge, that when we're attempting to serve students or when we're attempting to support students, oftentimes we may physically see them, we may classify them a certain way, but they may not necessarily self-identify as such. So that's part of what we also wanted to highlight. And that's, this figure to the right is that you see Soledad O'Brien, for example, and Pele, they're all within, they're Celia Cruz, they're all Latinos, and that's extremely important to acknowledge. The other aspect is that when we think about Latinos, we think about Latino America, and that's not necessarily true. There's also Latinos in Spain, so are they considered part of being the Latino community? It depends who you ask. There's a country in Africa, Equatorial New Guinea, that is Spanish speaking, and but they're not considered Latino. So why is that? Is it because it's in Africa and it's a different continent? And so there's a lot of questions around the social construction of race and ethnicity, and how our in terms of race, we're extremely diverse, but not just race, it's also culture, it's also history, it's also nation of origin. And even within that, there's local languages that are also indigenous languages that continue to add to the variation. So when Marie was talking about their enrollment on college campuses, we know that in order for students to be successful, in order to succeed, they need to feel a sense of belonging, and they need to feel like they're being represented within the curriculum. And when we talk about Afro-Latinos, Afro-Latino wasn't necessarily even a term until maybe 6-7 years ago. And so now with Amara La Negra and like other hip hop type individuals who are more present and talking about these conversations, it's beginning the conversation, but those individuals who have who are Afro-Latino know they're Afro-Latino, right? And so their experiences have gone unrecognized and really underserved on our college campuses. Next. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the legacy of colonization. We've touched a little bit on this already, but we wanted to highlight that early explorers of the Americas were often thinking about them being white men. Christopher Columbus or Magellan or all these other individuals who came about and led a conquest and invaded the Americas. But in the early explorers also, among them were free Black men who were also part of the conquistadores. They decided to also stay. Jimenez Roman wrote the Afro-Latino Reader, and they talk about that. They write about that, and they mention how even within the early explorers, they were Black men, and those Black men decided to stay. So even when we look at the legacy of Black presence within the United States and in the Americas, it's not always tied to slavery, and so that's something that we need to acknowledge as well, right? There isn't as much documentation around it, but there are experiences there. Also, this notion around mestizaje. Clearly, I'm not Afro-Latina. I'm sure I have some type of mixture within my DNA, but I physically don't present it in that way. And so I want to make sure that we understand that I am mestiza. I identify as mestiza, but part of my identity towards that is also because of this ethnic and racial ontological condition that has been imposed upon Latinos, and understanding that, you know what, you're not a mixture, all of these different things. You're something special. You're a mestizo, right? And so that was really our Darwinian term that was created, and many times by Latin American philosophers after the independence of many Latin American countries. The countries all over Latin America were still heavily divided, so they created and upheld this notion of mestizaje as a new race. You are a raza cósmica, for example, in Mexico. Jose Vasconcelos talked about this raza cósmica, this cosmic race, this new race, la raza de bronce, as a way to bring together and unify a nation that was heavily divided. And so part of that was, we are mestizos, we're not Black, we're not Indian, they use the word Indian, but we are a new race. And so a lot of us now understand mestizaje as the emblem for Latino representation. And oftentimes that's what social researchers tend to also adopt for our studies when we try to assess the experiences of Latinos in the United States. So in particular, we assess the experiences of mestizos, not necessarily the experiences of indigenous peoples, like Latin American indigenous peoples or Black Latinos, but it's almost always centered around mestizaje, as if that is the representation and the experiences of all of Latinos. So we wanted to make sure that we identified that that's one of the largest issues of that we face within social research, is this whole notion around mestizaje as being the emblem of Latinidad. The other aspect is that Latinos are neither biracial nor multiracial, and that's something that's extremely important. Again, when we talk about how do we best serve our largely growing diverse population, and people say, oh, well, Afro-Latinos are biracial. No, and we want to make sure that we recognize that it's this rich amalgamation of this historical mixture that we have spent so much time talking about and setting up, that it is embedded within the DNA, within the history, within the culture, that you cannot say that it's biracial, because there's so much more into it. So it's important for us to recognize that while we do not need to recognize biracial and multiracial student experiences, Afro-Latinos are neither of those, and they do present a very different experience than that group that we just discussed.
Right. Yeah, and I'll talk more about that later. Yeah.
Next.
Okay. This is a little clip. It's 2 minutes The image on the upper right is a static image of the flow of Africans to the Americas. And the bottom, the larger image, and you can go ahead and click on it, Amy, is a 2-minute time lapse of the between the continent of Africa and the Americas. And so the flow, it's mostly from the west. And you'll see it ramp up right around 1700. It's just constant. And you can understand now the lives lost along the way, and why the frequency of the trek had to be just so, because it was arduous, it was dangerous. And I don't know if you remember seeing the movie Amistad. It's a really good representation of what happens when ships need to pass off cargo, human cargo. They just put a heavy weight, item people to get human stock together and push them overboard. And that's how it was. It provides the frequencies you can see now. Depending on how you do the centuries, it's either now we're entering the mid to late 1700s or 1800s, 1740s, 1745, the bulk of the importation of human supplies for the Americas. In order to cultivate the land, in order to bring that back to Europe primarily. And you can see there's just a tiny little flow going into the United States, but most of it was going to the Caribbean and the eastern coast of the Central and South America. But I think people get it doesn't.
I think it's particularly important to recognize and acknowledge the amount of people taken to Brazil, enslaved individuals taken to Brazil and the Caribbean, like you were saying, right? And so again, I think it shows a visual representation and really across time in terms of what we were talking about, that Afro-Latinos, Afro-Latinx individuals are not biracial or multiracial as we define it within education and within the United States. And so this really has a lot to do with the historical legacy of colonization. Next.
Hold on, I'm trying. There it goes. There it goes.
Yeah. And so when we had talked a little bit about, we mentioned that the study of Afro-Latinx people in sociology and psychology has been around for a while. Anthropology, Latin American studies, we could keep going. But definitely within higher education, it's more of a recent phenomenon. It's a newly formed line of inquiry. Marie wrote her dissertation around Afro-Latinx experiences. I did it as well, and my line of research centers around these experiences. Jasmine Haywood has also written on it. And so we wanted to make sure that we also highlighted, for student affairs professionals and those working in higher education. So now what, right? We know all of this about the colonization and the history, and you went through all of this. How does it relate to my students on campus? Well, what we do know is that Afro-Latinx students encounter difficulty finding community on campus due to their phenotype, right? So we talked a little bit about colorism and how colorism impacts them, but it's not always based upon darker skin tones. Oftentimes, they may not encounter a sense of belonging because they may be too light-skinned for their groups, right? And so, why are you saying you're Black when you're too light? So that's something that has also come up in our studies. Languages spoken, so it's not just Spanish and English. I conducted a study with Afro-Latinx students, 12 self-identified Afro-Latinx students, and within that 12 group student population, there were 6 different languages spoken. And so again, language matters. Oftentimes Spanish is utilized accepting or rejecting within the Latino community, but it was also a factor within the Black African American community. If you spoke Spanish, then somehow you are not necessarily Black enough, or you're trying to whiten yourself or be something better than us. And within Spanish, within the Latino community, it was, oh, you're dark-skinned, but you speak Spanish, you're cool. But you can't be too dark-skinned and speak Spanish, because then that doesn't really save you. So Spanish within the Latino community has been utilized almost as one of the factors utilized in assessing group membership. So why is that important? It's important because we know that numerous studies, right, in sense of belonging and persistence, students have to find a community on campus in order to persist. And so what we know is that if they are finding difficulty if they encounter difficulty in finding group membership, it's going to directly impact not only their sense of belonging and their persistence, but then also their identity development within on their college campus. We know that in college years, that's when students are really identifying who they are. They're exploring their identity. They're exploring how they relate to others and society, and they're trying to create a connection with the content taught in their classroom. So if there is no connection, if you are Afro-Latino and you don't feel a sense of belonging, then your persistence is definitely going to be complicated. And then finally, this perceived foreigner status is something that definitely was illuminated within my studies. And so what students were talking about was that depending on how they presented, I had students who were Garifuna from Honduras, and they were saying that they were perceived as African immigrants because not only did they present with a darker skin tone, their phenotype was darker skin tone, but they also spoke with an accent. And so they weren't even perceived as being foreign from Latin America. They were perceived as being African. And so their treatment was completely different, not only by Black African American students on campus, and by Latinos, but also by African immigrants. When they found out that they were not from Africa, then all of a sudden their group of friends treated them differently, because at first they thought they were African, but now that they were from Latin America and they spoke Spanish, then all of a sudden it placed them in a different experience. So these things matter. They complicate their sense of belonging on campus. And so it goes to the second point, which is encountering this difficulty in gaining group membership due to their double minority status. So being both Latino and Black, right? Oftentimes Black students tend to congregate with Black students, but within the United States, what we see is that Black is almost synonymous to African American, and within the Latino community, depending on where you are, region matters, right? So in California, Latino tends to be heavily Mexican. In the East Coast, it tends to be heavily more Dominican, Puerto Rican, more Islander. And so even that matters, and region matters. So I'm looking at a new study that looks at the experiences of student affairs professionals and higher ed professionals across the United States. And what has come up and surfaced is that region matters, nation of origin matters, or familial nation of origin matters, because even if you are able to gain some type of group membership, the nationality or family history also plays a role in sense of belonging. Did you want to add anything, Marie, to this section?
No. Really good point.
And so what we have found out, these are a number of points. So pan-ethnicity, pan-ethnic identity, having a connection, the difference between, for example, African-American students or African-American individuals and Afro-Latinos is that many Afro-Latinos are able to pinpoint where their nation of origin is, or where their family's nation of origin is, or where they're able to trace back history to a physical, a piece of land outside of the United States. African-Americans don't have that experience. A lot of them were neglected of that experience based upon how they were enslaved, and their ancestry is of people who were enslaved and brought to the United States. So this pan-ethnic identity allows for them to be able to go back and forth in terms of cultural heritage and cultural history and language and traditions that, again, African Americans don't necessarily have. I talked a little bit about region within the U.S., and I want to leave enough time, for us to also go into our final section. So I'm going to skip over that. But region matters as well, and even within the U.S. matters. So forget region within Latin America when you're talking about, country matters, right? And so then if you talk about region within the U.S., and that complicates things even more. I talked a little bit about language already. And this whole notion around deterministic views of race and ethnicity has really thrust Afro-Latinos as a whole, not just Afro-Latino students, but anyone really into invisibility, because people are judged based upon their phenotype and not necessarily who they are or how they self-identify. So when you don't see yourself reflected in society, in Hollywood, or any other place, then you are also going through this process of self-identification and exploration. And if you don't have the resources, then it really lends to invisibility. You see that you are not, you may receive messaging that you may not be worthy of assessing or understanding or including. And then essentialistic forms of Latinidad and Blackness coerce them to decide between the two. So I provided some examples of how they are expected and pushed to either identify as Black or Latino when I talked about language, but not necessarily both, right? And so in the study that I did with 12 Afro-Latinx students, it was in the Bronx. It was in a historically Dominican community, and every single student said that they had never met another self-identified Afro-Latinx student on campus. And I'm going to repeat that. They had never met another Afro-Latinx student on campus. And what that means is that we're not having conversations around supporting Afro-Latinx students. We're not creating the space that they need in order to be able to self-identify as such, right? And we're not having these conversations around identity and what it means to complicate Latino identity as a whole. Let's break it down. We're not having those conversations. And so that when I had a focus group with them, that was their first time that they had met other self-identified Afro-Latinx individuals. And that to me was, I mean, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that they had never met another self-identified Afro-Latinx individual, when that is one of the hubs of having Afro-Latinx individual or people in a community. Now, they had met people off campus, but not on campus. And so that also talks about a larger issue around then what do we do within our campus community to create space for them. And so that's what we're going to the next slide, where Marie will talk a little bit about.
Yeah, one of the things that that spurred even my dissertation was that my experience coming to a four-year institution, an R1 institution here in Southern California. I transferred in, and one of the things that I went to was the cross-cultural center, and I walked into the Latino student group office, and they said the Black students office is down the hall. And I said, no, this is where I think I belong. And they go, oh, okay, well, and I said, so then when are your next meetings? And they told me. I did go, and I was again given another, what I've now coined a litmus test at the door. And I was asked, are we going to help you? I said, well, I'm here for the Latino student organization meeting. And so I went, and then I sat down, and I was new, and so I knew there was a lot of them knew each other already because I transferred them. And so I was this foreigner that phenotypically didn't belong, given what their perception of being Latino was. And then started again what I said, like, cultural litmus test. So you speak Spanish? Oh, okay. Were you born there? Yes, I was. I was born in Vieques, raised in Culebra. So you know how to dance? Talk to me. You know how to cook Puerto Rican food? I said, yeah, I do. And I'm thinking, who died and made them the gatekeepers? And so that's one of the reasons when once I finished my undergraduate experience, which that theme continued throughout my time there. I realized, wow, as a student affairs professional that I became after graduation, there are no spaces for people like me. And like I mentioned before, we disappear or we choose to either not engage at all in any cultural group, or if we have affinity with the Black community and a familiarity with the Black community, because like Claudia was saying, Black is synonymous with African American. People see me as Black, so they assume I'm African American. I'm not. I don't know the cultural cues. I don't know the unspoken language, the subtleties, all the things, and the nonverbals. I don't know those codes of conduct. I know them for the Latino community, so I fit right in and I can read that community. And so when I walk into a Black community, an African American community, I bump into them, and they realize I was like, oh, okay, so she looks like us, this is not like that. I said, clearly, I'm not. And so and knowing the language and engaging those students as a staff person is really important for them to then realize, oh, wow, so there's a whole population of Black students that are part of the Latino diaspora, and we need to create spaces where we can talk to each other and then allow them as well to speak, not used necessarily as bridges because we're not tools, but realizing that we live in these worlds, we go back and forth. And so understanding from the student affairs perspective that our language needs to expand, and that comes with a deeper understanding of the Black diaspora and the Latino diaspora and where certain populations fit and don't fit in, allowing a student to self-identify and believing them. And realizing, and I didn't get a lot of belief from the students when I was a student, but I did from the faculty who traveled, the faculty who were born abroad, who realized, well, of course there's Black people in South America, the ethnomusicologists and anthropologists, populations either through their research or through their friendship circles. Of course they knew, so I wasn't an anomaly for them. But their children, or the equivalent of their children who were born and raised in Southern California, or at least in the United States, didn't. So understanding through a student affairs lens that even among the student population, like Claudia was saying, there's going to be a mismatch in understanding of who fits in where, and not really even us who are Afro-Latinos being able to say, oh, okay, well, I wonder if there's any others, and assuming the other Black people we see on campus are also African American and not Latino like us, because we've grown up in this racial matrix of understanding race and ethnicity as almost being mutually exclusive. And so the last question of, what are you doing on your campuses to serve Latinx students? Is something that I want to explore now in the last 10 minutes that we have, because I'm sure something is being done. And if not, I encourage you to do something, because it is a population of students, just like Aston, way back in the day, I'm talking like 25 years ago, was saying that students feeling like they belong is really one of the biggest factors in determining whether or not they persist to graduation. And now as student affairs professionals, who in my personal and professional opinion, are in charge of the out-of-class learning of students. So we'll also be educators, where we don't work in a private sector where we're just punching the clock. We're part of an educational environment. So our role, to a certain extent, is an educational role. And with that comes our responsibility for the out-of-class learning of our students. What are we doing to ensure that they persist to graduation? So I'll put that out there to the student affairs folks who are in other faculty that might be joining us. What are you doing? So I don't know, Amy, if we can start unmuting people, or if anybody said anything yet to, I know there's a text function to this, in platform, so I wonder if anyone raised their hand virtually and want to say something.
And so maybe while we wait, I can, some of the things that we've discussed, that Marie and I have discussed, and please, if you want to talk, then go ahead and interrupt me. To make sure that, I'm not, that we're not just silent. We did want to make sure that we identified that Afro-Latinos, just like anybody else, don't exist in vacuums, right? And so a lot of our research centers, we talked a lot about social cultural factors, historical factors, colonization, but that matters, right? In order to understand our student population, in order to understand their experiences, we need to account for all of these different factors as well. So in having conversations around that, it's directly tied to their experiences and how they are perceived and how they feel. Also, culture matters, as Marie was saying. So even with your example, that painful example, you were saying, well, you perceive me to be this way, but culturally I have no connection to the culture that you are ascribing to me. This is my culture. And so as student affairs professionals or individuals serving our students, that should be, that's a starting point. I was just recently at Bowdoin College in Brunswick in Maine, and their student population of Latinx individuals as a whole is like this big, right? But they began the conversation around Afro-Latinx identity. So what can college campuses do? Begin programming around, situations like this, conversations around this, and don't just limit it to Latinx Heritage Month, right? Or Black History Month. Let's have these programming and these opportunities to come together beyond just these 2 months. Let's be able to have these conversations embedded throughout our programming. So those are 2 simple ways, of doing it. Finally, institutions, we have to do data collection. We have to collect data on our students, and I know it's very difficult to have this conversation with our data center. But having conversations around, okay, the federal government requires us to collect this data. Can we go beyond that and ask questions for our internal use? Let's understand how our students self-identify. Let's allow them to identify both as Black and Hispanic, so that then we could use that data to better serve our students. We want to make sure that we also recognize that best practices aren't best practices unless you're able to tailor it to your college campus. There is no magic pill. There is no magic solution around best serving your students. So understanding what your student population is and how they self-identify, providing the opportunity for them to self-identify is extremely important. But if you get a best practice and it's working on X college campus, that college campus is not yours. And so there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done within our institutions to better understand not just our students and where they're coming from locally, but also historically. What is their experiences with this this political climate right now in the United States that is not very friendly to a lot of minoritized individuals? What is the impact that it's having on our students? Maybe it's the time where they are requiring and really hoping that we create a space where they're able to then self-identify as Afro-Latino or whatnot. So these are a couple of examples of what has been done in other college campuses that is working. But then opening the conversation to students. So when I was at Oregon State many years ago, they would have concilios, and what a concilio was just let's come together and let's talk. Maybe having these almost like town hall meetings, having these open forums for individuals or students, even practitioners, right? Oftentimes we're talking about students, but also in the most recent study that I've been working on and interviewing professionals, they also feel very lonely. They also feel like their experiences have not been recognized or acknowledged. So opening it up for individuals to be able to share their experiences would be great starting points.
Anyone? Overwhelmed? No. Just jump in. I don't know, like I said, I don't know.
So we're opening it up for questions, comments, concerns.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So my name is Michelle Canellis. I'm currently over at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. Not really a comment, more just like a thank you. I identify as Afro-Latina, and I have spent many of my last several years just kind of self-identifying and going through, the experiences that you guys kind of talked about. I was also born in Puerto Rico, and I kind of have the familiarity and affinity to the Black community. And so I was raised in Philly after I left Puerto Rico, and over there is exactly what you guys talked about. It was like being different was questioned. The fact that I didn't look like every Latina or Latino there was completely questioned, but I never experienced any of that in Puerto Rico. And so kind of just dealing with my Latino family and friends, just questioning, like, are you sure you're not Black? Are you sure? Whatever the case is. And so while the population here at my current institution, doesn't really affect, I don't have a lot of communication or touch with that community. I just wanted to take this time to say thank you. I'm currently in the process of searching for doctoral programs, and Afro-Latinx research is one of my research interests. Identity development, kind of coming from Puerto Rico to the US, all of that. So just thank you.
Come to Texas. Come with me.
What's funny is my mentor said he was your mentee. He's the one that told me about the webinar.
Oh, good.
Step in Santa. So thank you guys. I just wanted to say that.
Of course. Feel free to reach out.
Will do. Thank you guys.
Anyone else? Mind blown, I know.
Well, and it might feel like one more thing that student affairs professionals now must be cognizant of. And I really do get that, because there's been a lot of work creep, just like it has happened in the faculty life. It also has happened in the staff life, where things that ordinarily were done by 3 people are now being done by 1. And so understanding that that's a reality is an acknowledgement that you're not crazy and you're not imagining things, and you may not have enough hours in the day to do this. It really, this webinar is just to increase your awareness and sort of give you a different lens to look at your students, and maybe help you when you're speaking to students, ask different questions or more questions that get at different issues for students, because there's a bit of an outing process among Afro-Latinos, meaning that we hide among the Black student population, and it's only when we show something about us that makes us all of a sudden, in your eyes, different from what's considered the Black community, the African American community, usually linguistic, that all of a sudden it's like, wait, what? You do a double take, and so which is a fine first response, but just don't stay there and look at us as some sort of like this, oh my gosh, I found a unicorn. So don't have that look on your face all the time with and how you interact with us, but realize it's like, oh, okay, there's more to the student population than meets the eye. And so I now need to figure out any sort of programming that we do needs to really speak to that level of diversity within the group. And it may not be all that difficult, but it might be as simple as having a conversation with the student population and asking, are any of you Afro-Latinos? And that's just a very simple conversation that a lot of them are like, wait, what? Somebody's asking? Somebody cares? So realizing that it doesn't take a whole lot of effort, and we're not asking for tectonic plate catastrophic shifts in how you program, but little things that will make students realize, oh, you're receptive. Kind of like those safe space trainings that you have a little badge on your door. It's not like you're screaming it from the rooftops, but then the students walk by your office and go, oh, that person now understands, and they're receptive, and it's a safe place for me to divulge this aspect of who I am. And so you speaking the words to people, it's almost like this, dog whistle in a good way. You're speaking to us and allowing us to speak back. And that doesn't take a whole lot, except a shift in our thinking, and therefore a shift in our language.
The only other thing I was going to say is that the conversations are certainly surfacing a lot more, and we're talking about students, but I also wanted to make sure that I echoed again the experiences of professionals who also feel isolated and are experiencing very similar things that I highlighted about students. And so Afro-Latinx professionals are also feeling that way, right? And so when you go to work and you're not feeling acknowledged or recognized, or you're constantly being asked, oh, I thought you were Black, what are you then? That has an impact, right, on your professional identity. It has an impact on how you feel. And so let's acknowledge that as well, that it's not just about students. It's not just about our work really encompasses upholding and supporting each other in this profession. Student affairs, we lead with an ethic of care. And so in understanding that not only do we have to be there for our students, but we're also called to be there for each other is extremely important. Some of the work that we're doing is we're presenting at national conferences. So we'll be at NASPA and ACPA and AERA and ASH and NCORE, hopefully. And so that's just another way, right, to have these conversations, to support these sessions and go there and meet others who are also maybe similar to Michelle. When you talked about, you're also going through the process, maybe that's where you meet other people who are also engaged in the same process or embarking on the same process. So a little shameless plug, if you're interested in a PhD program, come to Texas on it is, you know, it's something that that I will continue to work on, and this is something that is not, again, it's not my work. It's really honoring the experiences of Afro-Latinx individuals. So I'm not speaking for their experiences. But I wanted to make sure that, you know, as a mestiza, I also call out the discrimination and prejudice that exists within our communities, right? And so part of that work is also doing authentic work that is centered around asset-based perspectives. So not all of it is bad. We've seen, Marie and I have talked a lot about how there really is this, and I coined it Afro consciousness, right? Students are waking up. They're saying, no, I'm not going to allow you to categorize me. This is who I am. I am beautiful. I am strong. I am intelligent. And I've just been neglected the opportunity to learn about who I am. But students are taking it upon themselves. And so hopefully the scholarship around Afro-Latinx students will continue to increase. Afro-Latinx professionals will continue to increase. And we're able to then push the boundaries of both Blackness and Latinidad to be encompassing of the two.
Great end.
Excellent. Man, at my mind, I've got so many things going through my mind, and I'm certain that so many of the others on the webinar, and I'll tell you, I've also been receiving emails as you've been going, and so would it be okay if we share your PowerPoint with those who have been emailing, and then also if those who are here or tune in later, can they reach out to you maybe by email?
For sure.
Absolutely.
With comments, because I feel the energy. I've been kind of fielding, you know, emails and messages that I'm like, there's some really dynamic conversations, I think, underlying this conversation, you know, and so I think people are really ready to jump out and engage.
We'll do a Google Hangout part 2.
Right.
We can go
2.0.
That's right. I love it, Marie. I love it. Well, thank you all so much. Like I said, I will be sharing that information and distributing your emails with folks so that we can continue in this dialogue, because I really do. I'm feeling the energy and the passion behind it, and folks wanting to really learn more and dive deeper. So thank you all both for sharing your knowledge and your understanding and experiences. It was very powerful and very helpful for me as a faculty who is teaching 3 different sections of student development theory, right? And how can I incorporate this into my classroom conversations in a deeper way? So excellent work. Well, thank you all. Have a
Thank you.
And,
thank you, Marie.
Oh, thank you, Claudia.
Gracias.
Thank you, Amy.
Mm-hmm.